So welcome to another episode of Planet Possible. We are delighted you're joining us to hear evidence-led discussion about the topics that are critical to the way we manage our water and environment. A huge thanks to our season sponsor, Atkins Realis, and you'll hear a little bit more about them later. We're really grateful for their support in enabling us to bring the pod to you. So if you're new to Planet Possible, I'm Niki Roach. I am a passionate advocate for all things water and environment, and I'm a proud fellow of CIWEM, which is the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. CIWEM members in over 90 countries are professionals with a breadth and depth of expertise in the topics that are shaping the future of our planet, and we'll be joined by many of them across the rest of the season. So in today's episode, we're exploring the impact of the general election that's just been called here in the UK. We've recently heard that the nation will be heading to the polls on the 4th of July, so we wanted to think about what the new government, whoever they may be, should be tackling in their first 100 days and their first year. So, to help us navigate the topic, I'm delighted to be joined by a wonderful guest and a regular on Planet Possible who has a wealth of experience thinking about government policy and its impacts on the environment. CIWEM's Director of Policy, Alastair Chisholm. Welcome to Planet Possible, Al.
Hi again, Niki.
Let's start off by thinking about the election. Were you surprised? Were you expecting it to go in July, or were you thinking we were going to have something later on in the year? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a surprise, isn't it? I don't think there were many people anticipating it at this time. A little while ago, people were talking about possibly a May election. Really, everybody was thinking it was going to be November time, announced at the Tory party conference. Or maybe that it might just be pushed as late as possible and we might be looking at December, January. So I think it has come as a surprise. But at the same time, it's been one of the most anticipated elections for a long time. I think certainly if you work in the water and environment world, we've been talking about it for a long, long time. So in many ways, pleased it's here.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, because what I hadn't appreciated is all of the things that stop when an election is called. And certainly, you know, the government goes into purdah. That's a word that I've only learned in the last few years, really. And so that means government bodies like regulators, so Ofwat and the Environment Agency, are suddenly impacted by purdah, and that stops some of their activities. And that in itself has a bit of an impact that I guess I hadn't appreciated until the last 24 hours, when suddenly you realise all those things that you thought might be happening might not be happening, or might at least be postponed. So it's going to be an interesting time over the next few weeks until we get to the 4th of July. So when we think about the new government, whoever they may be, from the 9th of July, I think is when Parliament reopens, isn't it? So what are some of the things that you would want them to be focusing on in their first 100 days? We're obviously pressing pause on some stuff across the summer that we were maybe expecting. So what does good look like for you, Al, in that first 100 days?
Get going with the things that we're not going to see over the summer and we were really hoping to see before summer recess. From a CIWEM point of view, probably Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act 2010 is the biggest thing. We're massively into our SUDs here, aren't we? And that's sustainable drainage systems.
Sorry, I was going to say Schedule 3 is something that some people will understand what that is, but for those people that have got absolutely no idea about what Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act is, give us like a 45-second, this is the thing that you've been waiting for and it's not come, explainer.
It is a little piece of that 2010 law that was supposed to put in place a mandatory framework for delivering sustainable drainage in new developments. And this has got a whole load of resonance with some of the challenges that we're seeing now, and particularly keeping rainwater out of combined sewer networks. And it should mitigate some of the impact that new housing has on overloaded sewers. Unfortunately, it was never commenced. And it was only when, around the pandemic time, storm overflows and sewage pollution became headline news, that politically there was a lot of pressure to put it back in place, because I think it became more widely understood that it was something that would help manage that situation getting any worse. And so government announced that they would look at whether they were going to implement it. They did a review and they formally announced that yes, they would do that, but that would be subject to some consultation on detail and things like thresholds of how many homes in a development it would have to apply to. You know, this consultation was due out, I think, originally last summer. And as with so many things of late, it's been disrupted by the churn of secretaries of state. We understood that it should be out either in May or June, finally. And of course, it's not going It's not going to be anymore. So that's one of the things that it would just be great to see that come out, just try and get that moving.
Is that just in England? Because have we got Schedule 3 implemented in Wales?
It's been implemented in Wales, and in Scotland they do it a different way. And yeah, so it's in England.
So Schedule 3 Flood and Water Management Act, that's number one. What else?
Yeah, another watery one. There's been a growing momentum around water efficiency, demand management, particularly, there's been growing awareness, I think, since the drought in summer 2022 of how exposed we are to potentially being hit by water shortages, serious water shortages, how climate is changing and really the need to beef up both big infrastructure, reservoirs and transfers and desalination and so on. But of course, those take a long time to build. And so for the next decade and a half, we're going to really have to lean heavily into water efficiency. So there was going to be a consultation on amendments to the building regulations that would potentially put in place a requirement for more efficient water fittings in terms of how much water they use, so taps and appliances. And also, government did commit to a labelling scheme as well. So requiring those things in building regulations, the levels to which that would be needed was going to be put forward for consultation as well. Get that one through as well. We want to see that really quickly in the next government. Moving away maybe from the water space a little bit into land use. There was some anticipation around a land use framework, so that would put in place some principles and guidelines on how we should use land better from a strategic perspective, where kind of low-grade agricultural land might be and how it should be used most effectively for things like carbon sequestration or flood risk management and that kind of thing. I don't think there were particularly high levels of expectation around what that might look like. So whilst it would be great to see something come out quite early in a next government, it would also be really good to see it done properly so that it had a spatial component. It was based around opportunity mapping, really understanding spatially where the big opportunities were to do things differently so that you could put in place the right incentives and fiscal mechanisms to drive the kind of land use that we need to see in the right places. There's plenty more. The environment is a very, very busy space and we could talk for hours. But for me, those are three things that I think have been very eagerly anticipated in different areas and it should be relatively good to go.
Okay, so Schedule 3 Flood and Water Management Act, building regulations and particularly water efficiency stuff. And that, I guess, is things like water labelling. So knowing if you buy a new washing machine, actually, is it an A rating? Is it a B rating like you get for energy? And then land use framework, but one that's actually a bit chunkier and a bit more meaningful than perhaps might have been anticipated. Cool. Okay, so there's some big stuff there. And whoever the new government are, they're going to be busy if they pick up our shopping list, which is good. That's the first 100 days. What about the first year? I mean, it's interesting for me that we'll get a new government elected, roughly the same sort of time that we'll have a new price period starting in the water sector. So that in itself is interesting because there's a lot of new stuff happening there, but that's with my water sector bias on. So let's pick 2 or 3 really big things that you'd like to see in that first year a government really getting stuck into.
So we launched our water manifesto, and when I say our, it wasn't a CIWEM thing. It was co-developed with a whole raft of different organisations, stakeholders and members of the public. But in the water space, really, we want to see a full review of how water regulation is actually working, if it is really driving the best outcomes, both for society and the environment. Obviously, we need to maintain secure supplies of water and proper treatment, but we really need to make sure that the environment is being looked after far better than is happening at the moment. And there's so many people out there who have said a lot of the regulation that we've got has been around for quite a long time now, really since water privatisation. The Environment Agency was set up in 1995 with the Environment Act. So these regulations have been around a long time. They've kind of evolved, they've been added to, they've been tinkered with, and it's become a little bit messy, a bit knotty. And meanwhile, we've seen different challenges emerge. We've had an awful lot of development in that time. Climate change is racing on and putting all kinds of extra pressures on things, more and more agricultural intensification. So just to look at how everything is working, whether it's fit for purpose for the 2020s And if it's not, or if it needs some tweaking, then have a good thorough look through in the first year, and then use the remainder of the next political term to do something ambitious and make some real change. And of course, regulators are part and parcel of that. There's been an awful lot of talk around regulators having their budgets cut, not necessarily being able to do everything that they were once able to do or that they need to do in future. And there's no point having robust regulation without the regulators equipped to be able to implement it and enforce it. So they have to be a part of the picture. And you know, in terms of water companies, they're right in the spotlight at the moment, and there may be things that could be done to create better assurance for water customers, for voters, just in terms of how those companies are incentivised, how they're regulated, to make sure that they're really acting in the best interests of their customers and wider society and the environment. So on the water side, there's that. Then we can look wider.
Before we do, actually, I was involved in a national debate on storm overflows recently. And one of the suggestions that was put into the debate that I thought was really interesting was the idea of like a water czar. And I've heard this mentioned quite a few times. And I was really interested in what your thoughts are around it, because I think so often, gosh, in my 20 plus years in the sector, you know, the idea of we work in silos, our regulation is in silos, we maybe need to take a more catchment-based approach. You know, I'm really interested in connecting things. I'm interested in how practically we connect things. And I thought it was a really interesting idea, and maybe it feeds into your holistic look at where we're at. Do we need a role for somebody to kind of spearhead that, do you think, really? And maybe somebody that's a bit independent of the sector to take a really good hard look at how we join the dots and think about things from more of a systems basis rather than a regulation or an organisational driven basis, do you think?
Yeah, so I'm not sure what I think about czars. I think as longer term roles, then that's what your Secretary of State should be there to do, ultimately, to pull it all together. But if we are talking about a review, then it needs to be an independent review. It needs to be independently commissioned and have someone who has that distance and is able to take a really objective, cold-eyed look at it. And I think for the lifetime of a review, and I think, as I said, you know, a year should be enough time to really get stuck into the weeds, but it needs to be done with ambition and commitment. Yeah, then maybe that's a kind of a czar role.
I just like the idea of somebody, looking across, I think, really, rather than just looking down, if that makes sense. So, yeah, and maybe that's the place to do it. So, okay, right. So we've done a bit of water. You were going to talk about catchments, I think. So what's the first year ambition for catchments from a new government?
Well, let's just pick up that czar strand. Catchment delivery is something that's really exercised a lot of minds in the last few years, and one of those minds has been Dieter Helm, for example, professor at Oxford, pretty well known in water spheres and in infrastructure spheres. And he had a role of a catchment system operator that almost was that role. It sat above everything, pulled the strings and pulled things together and did the connecting and did the facilitating. And maybe there is a role for lots of czars actually at the right scale and in the catchment context, or maybe in the regional context. This is something that we suggested in our Freshwater Future work, but others have suggested. There's the Sustainable Solutions for Water and Nature, the SWAN piece that was done in about February time, and there's many others besides that have been talking about this, the likes of the Rivers Trust. How you take things like the catchment-based approach, which is very bottom-up and small scale. We've got 100 or so catchment partnerships doing often really good work locally, but they do struggle for funding, and they do struggle to be able to convene all of the right parties. So we need some kind of governance arrangement that pulls together the various funding flows that exist within a catchment and are able to prioritise investment in a way that it targets the most harmful or the most beneficial outcomes that exist in a catchment and a sort of a regional context. That has to be underpinned by really good understanding of what's going on in those catchments. So we need really good monitoring. And I think there's a pretty good appreciation that monitoring of what's going on in the water environment is not as good as it might be. And obviously there's lots in the Environment Act to require extra monitors upstream and downstream of outfalls and that kind of thing. But really proper catchment scale monitoring that informs a prioritised list of activities and that is then fundable and investable, irrespective of whether it sits within the water industry or whether it's a flood risk management thing or whether it's an agricultural thing. In the agricultural context of catchments, obviously, farming and land use does have a really big impact on water quality in our rivers. It's not just water companies and sewage. But farmers, a lot of the time, they are operating at the margin. They're up against it. They need a combination, I think, of enough advice, the right incentives through agricultural schemes, but also with a little bit of a hard regulatory component in there as well that includes better monitoring of what's going on farms and some sticks in the right place to make sure that the worst offenders do actually get punished and there's a gradual improvement in the agricultural impact on rivers as well. So lots to shoot at there as well.
Our 2024 season of Planet Possible is supported by one of the leading engineering and design consultancies in the world, AtkinsRéalis. Here at Planet Possible, we bring a diverse range of voices from across the international water and environment sector to explore how to tackle some of the biggest challenges we face. And that aligns perfectly with the AtkinsRéalis purpose of engineering a better future for our planet and its people. We're really grateful to AtkinsRéalis for enabling us to bring another exciting year of Planet Possible to you. You've talked a bit about monitoring, both for your first point around water and then around catchment management and regulators with teeth. But I guess when we talk about that, we really mean well-funded, like adequately funded. We've not really talked about funding here, but in that first year, it feels like it kind of is a natural conclusion, which is that we need to invest more from government in the environment. We may also be asking other people to invest more in the environment, but the groundswell has been, I think, that people value the environment. The public pressure around things like storm overflows, for example, demonstrates how much people are really bothered about healthy rivers, for example, healthy landscapes, nature recovery. Do we need to put our money where our mouth is? And do we need the new government to put its money where the public's mouth is on this kind of topic?
I think there's a number of components to this. First, I think we need to make sure that we're measuring and counting the benefits of managing the environment well, properly, because I think that's undercounted at the moment. There is an aspect which is funding for public bodies and those regulators. They need a foundational capacity to be able to function properly. Obviously, the current or the last, is it? Yes, guess it is the last government. That feels so weird to say. They put in place measures that would increase the charges for regulated bodies, and those monies would go back to the Environment Agency and enable them to invest in more regulatory capacity. So there's a component of that. And then there's also the component which is polluter pays. There's more measures being put in place to lift the cap on penalties that can be levied against polluters. So I think it's a combination of all of those things, but fundamentally it's a recognition that the environment cannot protect itself. We are absolutely reliant on a healthy environment. We will be more reliant on a healthy environment as climate change advances, and we really need that resilience that nature can help provide for us. We've got to invest in it. We've got to invest more in it. We've been sweating that environmental asset for too long.
I am nodding furiously. I agree. All right, so we've done water. That's one of them. We want the new government to think about ambitious catchment management. I asked you for two or three. I'm going to push you for a third. What's the third area that you would really like the new government, whoever they may be, to focus on in that first year?
It's how we do development. There has been this perennial tension between delivering housing targets or delivering infrastructure and that being at odds with conserving nature or building nature into it or making it sustainable. It's a myth. It's entirely possible. And there's been so many guests on Planet Possible before talking about how you do green building, how you do green roofs and what have you. We can build low carbon, water efficient, green. You live in one, Niki. I mean, I do my best in my little terrace house, but in this day and age, there should be no difference between extensive housing delivery and green delivery. So we need to think about our homes at the individual property level, and also the communities and the places that we're building very much more through the sustainability lens, the climate resilience lens. I was looking at sustainable drainage retrofit recently, and the borough of Enfield, actually, I did a little bit of filming there a couple of weeks back, and Enfield are a bit of a leader in suds retrofit. They've put in about 250 rain gardens over the past decade.
What's a rain garden now?
A rain garden is a form of sustainable drainage system. So it's basically a little garden that you put normally in the highway somewhere. So in a bit of road, in a bit of pavement, you can build pocket parks that basically it's natural sponginess in a grey urban area. And that's the retrofit component. But Enfield Borough say that to deal with the increased flood risk that's coming from climate change between now and 2050, they're going to need to deliver 500 of these every year. That is, 10 a week?
I'm not checking your maths. That's a lot of pocket parks. I love that expression. I've never heard that before.
We use the term spongifying now, and I keep saying I hate it. But actually, the more I rehearse that with everybody, they say, yeah, I know what you mean, but it kind of works.
Spongify. What do you actually mean by that? What is spongifying?
Work in sustainable drainage systems into our existing and new villages, towns, cities, green roofs, rain gardens, tree pits, little pocket parks, even water butts. Just things that will capture water and stop it going into combined sewer networks or other drainage networks that are increasingly at risk of overflowing and flooding. You know, there's a big piece which involves maintaining the infrastructure that we've got better. A lot of our infrastructure delivery focuses on what we call capital delivery. For various reasons, it seems more attractive. It's easier to plan for and make financial settlements from a government point of view for a long term, or for, say, a 5-year period, and plan around that. Whereas maintenance budgets tend to get confirmed on maybe a rolling annual basis. They're not often ring-fenced for a certain purpose, so they can get eaten up by competing pressures in the public sector. The adequacy of infrastructure maintenance is a bit of a root cause of some of the problems that we've seen in recent years, and that really needs to improve. Let's just build green. It's possible. And it will make much, much nicer places to live for people.
Yeah, I mean, I remember we did an episode a few seasons ago, a brilliant episode with Maya Butler from Natural England and Stephanie Smith from Bradford University Teaching Hospitals, talking about green and blue social prescribing. And if you haven't listened to that, I would encourage you to go and listen to it. It was a cracking episode. Amazing topic, and basically quantifying the health benefits from being around blue and green spaces. So, you know, green spaces obvious, and blue being near water. Local GP surgeries are prescribing that for people with a whole range of mental and physical health conditions, in addition to often a more medicalised treatment. And when you start to think about, I love the idea of pocket parks. I've never heard that expression, and I work in this space. But actually, just greening up the environment has so many other benefits, doesn't it? Some of those are easy to quantify, some are a little harder to quantify, but you feel them, I think. So it will make more climate resilient, but also more pleasant places for people to live, and particularly for those people who might be in neighbourhoods that are low income, that are struggling for access to green space in the first place. That's even more important, to be able to put those kind of things in to reduce flooding, but also to improve just the environment that those communities are living in, really.
It's not just water, it's heat as well. This is a big thing, you know. Over 3,000 people excess heat deaths during the summer 22 heat wave. And if you've got a natural surface that's in the shade, and on a sort of a typical 30-degree day, that natural surface, if it's in the shade, it's going to be at ambient temperature. If it's out in the sun, it will be about 40 degrees centigrade. If you've got concrete surface, that would be at about 50 degrees centigrade. If you've got a black tarmac surface, that would be about 60 degrees. And all of this radiates back. And this is the urban heat island effect. The more we can put natural surfaces back in and put some trees in that can give some shading, it's not just about water, it's about overall thermal comfort, and it's huge.
I remember Daniel Johns actually talking about exactly that in schools. Season 1 and we were chatting about the challenges of schools overheating, and they'd done a load of retrofit work at his local primary school for exactly that reason, because actually the classrooms were overheating, children were really uncomfortable in the summer. And so, thinking about what can you do to school buildings. It's not just homes, is it? It's also, those other municipal spaces that we use. And it's in so many countries around the world, this is obvious, but for us, we've always had this very sort of temperate maritime climate. We've cut, you get the odd hot summer and, it's going to be so much more extreme. We've really got to think about ingraining these principles into the way that we build as well as retrofit, haven't we now?
Yeah, and it translates through into things like productivity. Very simply, there is economic benefit there.
So we've got 3. We've got focus on the water sector and that independent review, and maybe there's a water czar, but there's certainly something about looking wholesale at the way we manage our water. There's ambitious catchment management, and then you've just talked about sort of sustainable homes, I guess, really, and linking planning. And we also talked about water labelling, so that brings in the people. Am I allowed to throw one in, if that's all right, Al? That's your list. I think it would be great if a new government thought about innovative ways to bring green finance into the water and environment sector, and doing that really impactfully. I don't have a clever answer, but I just feel like some of the reasons that there's inertia from making a real change is because of the kind of financial mechanisms that we have, or access to finance. So if we could connect people that want to invest in the environment because it's the right thing to do with places that need investment in a much more joined up way, I just think that could unlock all sorts of potential, really, from like large scale, how do you invest in, maybe it's the future of the water sector potentially, down to, individual farmers or collective groups of farmers looking to think about doing nature recovery or looking to do circular economy stuff. So for me, connecting really innovative green finance across the water and environment sector would be amazing if there were mechanisms to do that a bit more rapidly. So that's mine, if I can throw a 4th cheeky one in.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. And we get told that there's no shortage of money sloshing around, but to some people it feels impossible to actually get their hands on it. So just making those mechanisms easier would be fantastic.
Yeah, a bit more transparent. Right, so final question for you. You know what's coming because you've been on the pod a few times. I'm going to pass you the Planet Possible magic wand. You can't tell me who you want to win the next election. I'm not letting you have that. But give it a wave. And apart from that, you can make anything possible. What would you want?
I just want to see an ambitious government on the environment. Look, we're in a climate and nature crisis, an emergency. We do not have another 5 years to waste. We need real commitment, real action, and not just sound bites on the environment. And we absolutely don't need culture wars. We need to bring people together around a really positive vision for what a resilient and clean and healthy environment looks like and B can unlock in terms of future prosperity. It's an absolutely fundamental goal, I think, for the next government, whoever they are.
Perfect. Al, couldn't agree more. Ambition on the environment, absolutely key. Brilliant. As ever, time has flown by and we're at the end of another episode of Planet Possible. Thank you so much for joining us. I really hope you found our conversation insightful. Hope it's given you something to think about in your world. You can subscribe to Planet Possible if you don't already on your usual podcast player to make sure you never miss an episode. And as ever, we'd love to hear your ratings and reviews, so drop us a line with those if you can. We've got more fantastic guests and topics lined up for the rest of the year, so I hope you'll join us for those too. All that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to my wonderful co-host, Alastair Chisholm. Thanks, Al.
Thanks very much, Niki.
That's it, everyone. Stay safe and we'll see you next time.
Planet Possible is produced by Bwlb. Bwlb Bwlb. The best ideas, the strongest content.